My name is Moihaki Kimura Morogori. I'm an Associate Director with the Rockefeller Foundation, and I'm very happy to moderate you through the next hour with this very distinguished panel. I think that we've spent the majority of the day talking about different thematic issues that we need to consider when we're talking about the space in Africa. And we'd like to turn the conversation now to what are some of the more practical issues in terms of how we can structure our response, either as philanthropic institutions or individual philanthropists. So allow me to introduce this panel, and I'll start off from my far left with Barbara Ibrahim, who's the founding director of the John D. Gerhart Center for Philanthropy and Civic Engagement, which was established in 2006 at the American University of Cairo. Barbara has a long history of working within both North Africa and the broader Middle Eastern region, so we're happy to have you here. Mahomed I think talked about his institute, which I will not repeat in French, but it is ISDL, and he's also done a lot of research with regards to philanthropy. And Dr. Zuma this morning actually quoted him in some of his research. Halima Mahomed is a philanthropy consultant and advisor with TrustAfrica. Her work focuses on strengthening the narrative, practice, and impact of philanthropic activities across the continent. And finally, Becky Nkosi Moyo is the Deputy Executive Director of the Southern African Trust and is well published on issues of civil society, philanthropy, governance, and democracy. So, earlier on, we've heard quite a bit about different aspects when it comes to philanthropy in Africa. Jane Wells told us this morning that this forum really is about learning, and I'm hoping that my panel today is going to take some time to share and reflect with the broader audience in terms of lessons which they've learned through their practice over the years. I'd like to reflect also on something that Dr. Zuma said this morning, and she said that we must be able to tell the African story. What is the narrative of Africa with regards to philanthropy and, most importantly, infrastructure within this sector? We've had generations of philanthropic activity. The question is, what do we know? What must we not forget as part of our intrinsic DNA when it comes to African philanthropy and the whole idea and notion of this, which has been in place for centuries? More importantly, what can we build on? What does a new generation of philanthropy need to know? And when I talk about philanthropy and philanthropists, and I think that the panel before us exemplified this, it's not just people who have large financial resources available to them, but it is also people who have time, who have talents, who have an interest in giving. And if we can also talk about what I call the 10-shilling philanthropist, that person who's out there who has resources where they actually want to do something, what message do we actually have for them? So I'd like to start off with Becky here. And I'd like to ask you, there's the notion of African philanthropy, and then there's the idea of philanthropy which is practiced in Africa. I know that you've been conducting research on this throughout the past couple of years. So I'd like to ask, what distinguishes the former from the latter? And more importantly, as we think about the sector, what lessons can we learn and draw from our history, both at a continental level and as we think about our countries and our communities?
Thank you very much. I need to apologize. I caught a cold last night, and so if my voice is hoarse, please forgive me. I think I would be very disturbed if I didn't acknowledge that the journey to today has really taken place when I was with TrustAfrica. And at least 3 colleagues here, from Mamadou, whose work was quoted this morning, it's actually in the book that we did at TrustAfrica. I've worked closely with Halima here, who is sitting next to me, in trying to write about this space. And so really I wanted to make that point that I recently moved from TrustAfrica, but the real journey on this work started when we were in TrustAfrica. In response to your question, I think I wanted to, so that I avoid overlaps, I wanted to really start looking at philanthropy and the history, at least from a Pan-African level. And then I think colleagues will try and look at it from either a thematic or even what's happening at a national level. So 3 issues that I want to talk about. One is that when you look at the Pan-African infrastructure for philanthropy, there's need for us to perhaps look at the normative framework. And from that perspective, I want to draw from the history of Pan-Africanism. That from the OAU Charter itself, one of the key issues that comes out clearly is the sense of what Africa can do together in a united format. And there are issues of solidarity, issues of self-reliance, self-sufficiency, and African renaissance. These permeate right across the normative framework, but also in terms of some of the practices that came to be put in place by the OAU then. I'm not yet at the AU level. So you will find that as you read through the history of Pan-Africanism and the establishment of the OAU, there's an intersection between what we see as African philanthropy and Pan-Africanism, especially in the quest for regional integration, for unity and emancipation from some of the oppressive situations that Africa went through. The Monrovia Declaration, for example, on guidelines and measures of, for national and collective self-reliance, speaks to that element, and it really begins to unpack what could be done by Africans in order to achieve development from a Pan-African, but also making use of what in most African languages we call Ubuntu, which is that you affirm one's existence by acknowledging their existence. So I am because you are. And that is really at the heart of what distinguishes African philanthropy from philanthropy in Africa. In Africa, I think in the morning we began talking about how we probably would start with a cause and then generate ideas and then look for resources to finance that. And I think it's a different take altogether from the other spaces. I think as you go down the history, you find that the establishment of the Africa Economic Community, for example, was specifically to put in place institutions and mechanisms that will drive this self-reliance. That is at the heart of African philanthropy. So the Abuja Treaty, the Lagos Plan of Action, the final Act of Lagos, all those embed in them the notion of the practice of African philanthropy. And then, of course, with the AU and the new frameworks that have been put in place, starting with the Constitutive Act, including the current frameworks around the alternative sources of financing, all those speak to what we also want to achieve from philanthropy. In the morning, Madam Zuma talked about the AU Foundation, which is just one element within the broader AU frameworks that have been put in place to practice and put into, into effect African philanthropy. So the African Solidarity Initiative of the Peace and Security Department, which really wants to address issues of conflict from a solidarity mechanism. The whole issue around the Africa 50 Fund, which is to mobilize resources to finance Africa's development. I could go on, but the point I wanted to make is that embedded within the whole Pan-African framework is the deeper understanding of African philanthropy, that one is because of others. The second point that I wanted to talk about quickly is that when you look across the continent, the philanthropic landscape is varied and cuts across a number of levels. So the first level that I wanted to talk about is the African platform that has been put in place by a number of African philanthropic institutions. And this dates back to as many as, but the formal launch was in 2009. And here I'm talking especially about the African Grantmakers Network. And this has been something that the institutions have put in place as a platform for collective understanding of both the theorization of philanthropy, but also the practice of philanthropy. And so what has happened over these years is really developing this space where these institutions come together to put in place a lot of best practices, but also how to learn from each other. So this space has already been there, and it's a platform that was identified by these institutions. The second element is that there's also Pan-African, global, as well as regional frameworks that have been put in place. And here I'm talking about institutions that look at the world from a Pan-African point of view. TrustAfrica is one of them. The African Women Development Fund is one of them. And these have been in the space for a long time, dealing with issues from a philanthropic point of view. We have regional institutions like the Southern Africa Trust. We have regional associations of grant makers like the East Africa Association of Grant Makers, and others like SAGA that died many years ago. But the point is that there have been all these spaces in place. And then the third element is that of what I see as individuals who think from a Pan-African point of view, and then they've lived their lives really guided by Pan-African ideals, and they've gone on to put in place institutions that actually do that. The final point really around this, and I have 2 minutes, is that how do we model, strengthen, and expand philanthropy across Africa? I think what the first point is, we really need to amplify what exists. So the formation of the AGN assemblies, for example, after every 2 years, we really come together to amplify what exists. We give African awards to institutions or individuals that will already live this kind of life. We have been profiling a number of philanthropists, and some of them are here in the room, together with City Press in South Africa, AGN, and the Southern Africa Trust. They are also giving platforms that MOTI has been funding in South Africa for us who are working at a regional level to actually amplify that. The second issue is around research and knowledge generation. We have consistently been writing on this field for more than 10 years. And basically the point was that we discovered that there was no documentation around African philanthropy. And consistently we had to put this on the agenda. It is now that it is recognized, and we now have literature across the spectrum on this, but there's more areas of research that we need to do. So writing and researching helps to amplify, to model, to strengthen, and expand philanthropy. We are now going into the second level of writing, which is not to say philanthropy exists in Africa. We are now looking at the intersections between philanthropy and the various economic sectors, for example, in mining, in forestry, and so on and so on. But we are also beginning to look at the frameworks that are used to talk about philanthropy. In the morning, there was a lot of reference to indigenous philanthropy. We are beginning to challenge that notion, because what it does, it creates a hierarchy of philanthropies and says African philanthropy is indigenous, and in another philanthropy is not indigenous. What it does is really to create a hierarchy, and that should not be the case, because once you do that, you really peripheralize Africans and their initiatives. So we are beginning to actually go deeper into the frameworks and beginning to create a situation where, from a conceptual point of view, we have an understanding of the positions of various philanthropies in the universal framework. And finally, I think it's the whole notion of institution building and advocacy. So development of an adequate conceptual framework is important, but equally important is really to put in place structures that respond to some of these developmental needs, and really, advocating for an enabling environment for philanthropy to thrive. One of the books that we did was there's this book that was mentioned in the morning, which is available from TrustAfrica, but also online in many bookshops. But one of the first books that we did to understand the space was to write a book on disenabling the public sphere. And the idea there was for us to understand the policy framework, including the legal framework under which philanthropic institutions and civil society operate. And so from that point of view, really, so those are the 4 areas where I think you can model, expand, and strengthen the infrastructure of philanthropy across Africa.
Thank you, Becky. Yeah. Halima, so one of Becky's final points was about the missing piece around research and writing to tell the African story. And I think that James Mwangi also mentioned this morning that when they were trying to look for statistics around what is happening with regards to African philanthropy, that was missing as well. You've been undertaking research in terms of the landscape of the philanthropic infrastructure that's available on the continent. So my question to you is, what is there? What is missing? What is working well? What do we in the room need to know in terms of potential things that we could invest in and really bring to the fore?
Thank you. So I think to start off with, I have to underscore what was said earlier this morning by Becky now, in that when we think of the infrastructure, we think of, there's a very varied landscape that infrastructure sector has to cater to. We have the institutional and the non-institutional. We have the different constituencies. We have private sector, we have corporate, and we have communal giving. We have giving that occurs at different wealth classes, from high net worth to giving that occurs, in everyday poor communities. We have giving that happens at multiple levels of scale, and often is not recognized. So it's only when it's a big number is it counted as philanthropy. But we don't stop to think about what are those small amounts end up cumulatively doing. And we need to think about an infrastructure sector that supports a thinking of philanthropy that is about more than just money. It's about other types of assets, physical, intellectual, other kinds of assets and mechanisms. So when we think about an infrastructure sector, it's a complex space, and it requires many different types of institutions, but it also needs some kind of cohesiveness around it in order to bring it together as a field. If we Becky had mentioned that 10 years ago there was very little that was written on African philanthropy, and the same goes when we look at the infrastructure sector. When we bring together philanthropy, we're at a very early stage, and this is a bit of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, we're lagging behind on the knowledge, on the data, on the mapping, on the systems, on the discourse, but on the other hand, it's a significant opportunity. There's a space here to revise, to reframe, to almost reconceptualize what is our narrative of African philanthropy, and our narrative that is rooted in our context and is based upon our lived realities, and that looks very different for us. So we've often engaged in global forums on philanthropy and come back feeling like they're not really talking to what we're talking about. They're talking to one part of what we're talking about, which is the institutionalized space. And how do we begin to support and create a sector that is able to cater to much more than just the institutionalized space? We've been engaging in this research, which has been really, really fascinating. But before I get to that, I want to say there's almost we're at a point in time right now where several factors have come together that enable us to almost leapfrog this space. On the one hand, there's this increasing recognition of the African discourses on philanthropy, and there are multiple narratives. We have to emphasize that there is not one narrative on African philanthropy. There are multiple narratives, and there's an increasing recognition of that. On the other hand, there's an increasing interest in the role that philanthropy is playing in society, very differently to the way it was before. So before it was just about give money, Now it's about understanding the ways in which we give money has a particular impact on the kinds of outcomes and impacts that we want to see in terms of a more just society. And people are starting to ask questions about what is that role and how do we understand it better. There is an increased visibility of giving. So giving has happened for centuries, but it's happened very under the radar. It's happened on one-on-one platforms. It's happened in a way that people have not talked about for various cultural, religious reasons, or any other reasons that are personal. But it's not been something people publicize. That's changing a little bit. And lastly, there's increasing emergence of spaces that are starting to say, what do we need to understand about philanthropy? How can we support and strengthen and advocate for the sector? So we're starting to see a pulling together. Becky mentioned the Africa Grantmakers Network, which has been in place, and that was one of the first spaces where we started to say, how do we bring together these multiple narratives? How do we bring together the different actors that are engaging in philanthropy to help us think about how do we move this space forward as a sector? If I look at a snapshot of the research that we've been engaged in, I'll tell, I won't go into the details, but I think that there are two words that characterize it. That's an emerging infrastructure and it's a maturing infrastructure. If we look at numbers, 15 years ago, there were no African infrastructure institutions on the continent. Whatever infrastructure support there was came from outside. So we went to convenings outside of the continent. We hired international experts to come and tell us about what we're doing, and today we can say there's over 35, we've identified at least 37, I'm sure there's probably many more that we haven't identified, institutions that are in some way, shape or form strengthening, supporting, advocating or advancing African philanthropy. And that's a huge leap in 15 years. They're all doing it at different levels of scale. It's a maturing sector in terms of geographic scope. The sector does follow where the activity is most visible, not necessarily most prevalent, but where it is most visible. So South Africa is really the space where institutionalized philanthropy is most visible, and so a huge chunk of the sector supports the African philanthropy landscape in South Africa. But there are spaces in Kenya, in Egypt, and emerging spaces in Nigeria as well, and we need to be thinking about those. There's also a maturing of the geographic space in terms of a movement from local and thematic-based issues to regional and then Pan-African. So we're seeing this pulling together also from a geographic kind of framework. There's a diversity of strategies. So some institutions, and there are a few, will focus on knowledge building and advocacy around African philanthropy. Some will look at service provision and intermediary services. Some will look at capacity building, or providing peer learning forums. And so they vary all across, and some of them try to cut across the sectors, some will focus in very specialized, localized areas. We're seeing a maturing in terms of capacity, in terms of knowledge, in terms of writers in the field. So Becky and I always talk about how, 10 years ago, it was very hard to find people who are writing on African philanthropy. Today, you're seeing a flourishing of it. In fact, and when we expand the notion of philanthropy beyond institutionalized, it's a whole different universe. We've just completed a pulling together of a database on resources that relate to African giving. And we've specifically not used the word philanthropy because we wanted to understand the different manifestations of giving on the African continent. And we have over 1,000 documents for the first time pulled together into one space. And there's a wealth of information there that we need to begin to engage with and understand and reflect on. So the space is really emerging and developing in significant ways. And lastly is there's a maturing around the discourse, around African institutions and philanthropic agencies claiming their own discourse and being able to sit at tables both locally and internationally saying, this is how it is reflected in our continent, and these are the multiple narratives upon which we can engage. And so that's been really interesting to see over the last several years. When I think about the infrastructure sector and what do we need to be looking at moving ahead, there are several things that we're doing, but we can do much more substantially, and we can do at different levels of scale. And so the first is around a thought leadership role. And I think really this is around asking the hard questions. So it's really important to do all of the nuts and bolts work. It's really important to bring people together, to provide services, to do the knowledge building, to reflect the evidence. But I think that a particular role for infrastructure institutions is to be able to talk to our peers and say, are you asking the right questions around your role, around your practice, and around your impact? And pushing those boundaries almost, because it's easy to get caught in a comfortable space. We're all doing this, there are different ways of doing it, and that's fine, but there are also different ways in which we can maximize the potential of philanthropy. There are important questions to be asked about process, and how process and strategy, on the one hand, what are our strategies and what are the opportunity costs of our strategies, and whose voices are we including in helping to develop those strategies. So, there are trade-offs we make when we determine something on the one hand, and when we seek to engage those that we are trying to support on the other hand by bringing them into the discourse and into the strategy development processes. And I think those are some of the very hard questions that it's important for our infrastructure institutions to begin to engage much more strongly on. I think that the other set of questions our infrastructure institutions need to engage more on is around the why question. It's around why are things the way they are? What are the systemic issues and the underlying drivers that have led to where we are as a continent, or where we are on a particular issue? And how do we create the spaces, the engaging spaces for our members and our networks to begin to think seriously and critically and strategically around those why questions?
Thank you very much, Halima. One of the things that you mentioned was around voices and who is responsible for coming up with these strategies when we're thinking about how the infrastructure for the sector is developed. And actually, one of the questions that I'm going to put to the panel for you to think about is, do we have a sector yet? Can we talk about that, or are we still broken up by different themes? But before we come to that, I'd like to turn the table to Mahomed, who's been working in West Africa for a long time and looking at how philanthropy is practiced at community level. So as we're thinking about voices and who's determining what this looks like, I'd like to hear your reflections in terms of your experience with that perspective.
Okay, thank you very much. If you would allow me to give my answer in French, it would be fine. But I'm quite sure your answer will be no. So I try to do my best to share my experience with you in the language of William Shakespeare.
Thank you.
I'd like also to thank the organizers of this forum, and thank in particular TrustAfrica and the International Development Research Center, IDRC, who helped me and who gave me really the support, me and my colleague, Dr. Ach, in writing that chapter on the institutional forms of philanthropy. Once again, thank you very much. I will talk about a kind of overview of individual international, and an overview of individual and community-based philanthropy in West Africa, and then about the challenges, opportunities, and lessons learned in the sector, maybe in West Africa. I think our friend from Dalberg this morning talked about individual philanthropy and community-based philanthropy. And as you know, and as he mentioned already, Africa is really has a tradition of solidarity, has a tradition of mutual help. And when it comes to individual philanthropy, we are all philanthropists. I think at a time or another, we gave some support to our friends, to our relatives, to our neighbors, and all this is part of individual philanthropy. But individual philanthropy is also, let's say, reviewed through some examples of wealthy people who are willing to share their wealth, their money, to support some causes. And we can give the example, for example, of Aliko Dangote, for example, from Nigeria, who last year or the year before gave about $25 million just in 1 year. In Senegal, we have, for example, our famous singer and worldwide star known as Youssou N'Dour, who also set up a foundation for the youth and who is really trying to give a kind of support to help the youth have a good education, find sustainable jobs. And I think all these are good examples in different areas. You have also other philanthropists like, for example, Ibrahim and so on and so forth. So all these are individual philanthropists who are really doing their best to show their solidarity with their African brothers and sisters. Community philanthropy is equally important. But the fact is, when we talk about informal community philanthropy, you have various examples throughout Africa. We have a lot of associations of people from the same village or from the same region who are really putting their efforts together, who are really trying to find solutions to the key problems that people are facing in their respective villages. And either in the rural areas or in urban areas or even with the diaspora, you have very good examples of people who are really philanthropists and who are really trying to share with their relatives and friends the kind of problems they're having. For example, you have a kind of Nigerian association in Connecticut in the USA. You have the Malian association in France. You have the Mauritanian association maybe in Germany and so on. All these are associations that really try to work with their communities really to find some solutions to the problems they're facing. I would like to mention now some challenges, opportunities, and lessons learned. Among the challenges, I could mention at least three. I think one of them is really how to redefine, or simply how to define philanthropy, because depending on the context, we may have a variety of definitions. And I think that we should see how to define philanthropy. And this requires, of course, understanding the deep causes of philanthropy. It may be obvious, but it's important to know why people are willing to give. Sometimes they don't give. It's also important to know why. Because if you don't know why they give, or if you don't know why they are not willing to give, it would be quite difficult really to push those people to give. The second one is how to build a strong infrastructure, philanthropy infrastructure. And I think Halima gave some avenues which are quite very interesting. It means that what kind of enabling conditions should be put in place really to have a kind of philanthropic infrastructure in Africa. And if that infrastructure is lacking, philanthropy will not be developed. And I could have given the example of street children in Senegal but unfortunately we don't have those institutions that really can help people mobilize the kind of resources. And the second one is how to catalyze the various initiatives in order to find solutions to the problems I mentioned already. And when we talked about the diaspora, at least the diaspora's contribution is 4% of Africa's GDP, which is, I think, really important. Now, one opportunity is really the zakat, because in Senegal or in some countries of in West Africa, you have also religious philanthropy, either they are Christians or Muslims. For example, for the Muslims, the zakat could be a good opportunity or means that could be really developed to develop philanthropy. And then in terms of lessons, a legal and regulatory framework is very important to facilitate giving. A sustainable resource base is also very important. Local ownership is also very important, transparency and accountability. Now, in conclusion, because there's one stop sign there, I wouldn't like to see it. Now, in conclusion, I would like to quote our Anglican Bishop Nobel Peace Prize, Desmond Tutu, who said that, "Do your little bit of good where you are. If those little bits of good put together that overwhelm the world." And my conclusion is, if you think that we are poor or there are some weaknesses, we can't do it, just think of this Ethiopian proverb, which says that when spiders unite, they can tie up a lion. When spider webs unite, they can tie up a lion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Mohamedou. I think that those were some very, very interesting insights. And I like your example about the zakah, which I think brings us very neatly to Barbara's experience. So we always talk about Africa, and I always wonder, is that really a fair departure point in terms of for us to have a conversation? Yes, we are 54 states. We are very different states. And then when you start thinking about the differences between North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, that brings us to another sort of break point. So from your experience, what have you seen from the North African experience with regards to philanthropy? Is it that different? Are we more the same? Or are we, do we have significant lessons to learn about?
Well, as you know, I come from an untroubled, calm city of Cairo. So, of course, we're in a very special historical moment, and I send you greetings from the mobilized populations of Tunisia, Libya, and Egypt. So, in a way, it's a unique moment for us. But I would argue, as we've been studying and trying to understand what makes transitions work or not work when they are sudden, unexpected, and dramatic, that some of the lessons really make sense for all of us. Because if you look across the continent of Africa, you hear the statistics we heard this morning about 10% growth for a decade in a country like this one. Those are major transitions that are going to impact everything. So I do think that North Africa has a lot to offer, and we have a lot also to learn from all of you. The concept of peer learning was mentioned quite a bit this morning, and it is an incredibly powerful concept. We brought Arab university presidents together a couple of weeks ago and thought that maybe they would stay for the opening speeches because they were sexy people that were giving the talks, and then they would go off. 2 days later, they were taking detailed notes about how to make their campuses more civically engaged, because there were peers who were doing it in other countries of North Africa, and they have great demand from their students. If they don't do it, they're going to have riots, and so they want to figure out how to do it well. So I think we do have a lot to learn. Unfortunately, there's a bit of history that we'll have to overcome. The whole Arab nationalist movement, I would argue, was a setback in a way, because the natural ties that North and West and Eastern and Southern Africa had for centuries were a bit separated, because many Arabs were told they should look to that cultural grouping. But I think that given technologies and the way that the new generation are getting information, it doesn't matter where it comes from, and we can reestablish a Pan-African movement. I have absolutely no doubts about that. Well, what are we learning from our transitions? One is to always have a plan B when you plan any activity, event, and always have a second way home, because we don't know when this street is going to be blocked or that highway is going to be blocked. So my young staff are getting very agile and very creative and very sort of stubborn about not letting a setback or something that they'd hoped would go one way and wasn't possible stop them. And this is, I think, true in dramatic transitions that are going to stretch over years and years, and maybe in some that are less so. That agility and flexibility, I think, is a special gift that we have as a private philanthropic sector. Sometimes we talk about that as we study what's going on across North Africa as the acupuncture role of private philanthropy. Sometimes our funds are minuscule compared to the World Bank, the EU, the African Union, but we can be there first. We can turn on a dime when opportunities present themselves. Our boards can be consulted sometimes just by phone calls rather than waiting for their quarterly board meetings or whatever else it is. So we can respond in ways that are incredibly important. So when Mubarak fell, and the very next day, the young people that had this sort of rush of adrenaline and euphoria that they had brought down a 30-year dictatorship started to look around for ways in which they could organize themselves either politically or around independent media or around political campaigns. There was very little in the way of mentoring and resources and reaching out to them that could have made a very critical difference, because they had a lot of energy and they had a lot of values. They knew exactly what they were fighting, but they didn't have the soft skills that some of us could have provided had we been a little bit more prepared. So I think that as those of us in the private philanthropy sphere, whether we're individuals, whether we're institutions, whether we're lenders or investors or grant makers, there really is a moment for us right now. I am based in a fairly well-off university with a good endowment, and our students pay a fairly high tuition to attend, and we have a lot of scholarships. But this year, I've had this semester a stream of students coming in my office and saying, I have one semester to go and I'm not going to be able to finish. My parents have lost their jobs and we've maxed out all the loans we can take. Can you help us? And I don't have a place to turn because we didn't establish the emergency scholarship funds that would have made this transition moment and the economic downturn that most families are facing not so draconian for these bright, amazing young kids that may now have to stop their careers for a while. When economies flounder, and I know most of the African countries are not in that moment right now, but we all know that cycles go up and cycles go down, it's really important to have these safety valves. We've talked a lot about money not being the most important thing, and I want to mention the convening role of private philanthropy, because in countries like mine and those across North Africa, we don't have one vision about how we want our societies to go forward. There are substantial majorities or minorities who have an Islamist or religious vision, which will be a bit exclusionary and will not be an open society to the rest of the world. And then we have this younger generation of more educated kids insisting on open, democratic, and more secular societies. And this is a major problem for us, and no one quite can figure out how to bridge this gap. But I have seen a few well-placed projects and ideas to roll up your sleeves, as we talked about this morning, and actually work together on local environmental issues. I've seen that begin to close the gap and to find some common cause that we can make together. I think I'm being signaled. I'd better stop.
I have the distinct pleasure of having the largest panel today, so I've had to manage them, and I thank you for allowing me to signal you when I needed to. So we've had we've heard quite a number of different elements come up: solidarity, the flexibility of philanthropy, that we are strongly rooted in Pan-Africanism. We need to see an increase in terms of research and learning. We live in an information age now, and how can philanthropy actually use that? We need to think more critically about influence, time, and our resources. And also, how can philanthropy learn to be nimble and step into the spaces when our countries are going to transition, either in terms of our successes, changes, or failures? So I'd like to open up the discussion to our audience, because we don't have a lot of time, so I won't take another round of questions, but I'd like to ask the panel just to think on that, and my question about, do we have a sector which we can all bound around, or is that something which we still need to work on? So any questions from the, okay, I see 1, 2.
Thank you very much. Again, my name is Yam Stracha, and I'm from the Packard Foundation. I want to thank all the panelists. It was very educative and informative. My question is, I think we have heard a lot about the different inputs that we require in order to develop the framework and the structure for African philanthropy. But I haven't heard much about the enabling environment, particularly the legal and political or policy environment that we require to have an effective philanthropy in Africa. So I would like to hear your suggestion and input in that respect. Thank you.
Okay. We'll take another question here, and then we'll go to Musimbi.
It's David Lewis from Corruption Watch. Can I just share briefly an experience that we're having that some may find interesting, but partly inspired by the imminent departure of Atlantic Philanthropies from the social justice funding scene, and they're major social justice funders, and partly inspired by the notion that there are lots of wealthy individuals and families in South Africa who may not have the inclination or individually the resources to set up their own foundations. A group of social justice foundations and beneficiaries like ourselves have set up a wholesale foundation, effectively, that will attempt, using ambassadors, people who are held in regard in that community, to solicit funding from high net worth individuals into a foundation that will wholesale funding to grant-making foundations. And it will be seeded by certain of those foundations as well. In other words, there will be no necessity to to hire a new building or to hire grant makers and administrators. It will pass the funding on to those who have an established portfolio of social justice funders. And the funders can decide whether they want to do this anonymously, or they want their names on the building, or they can decide whether they want the money to go to Corruption Watch or to just any social justice institution that is served by this. But it seems like a potentially a good model. And the second thing that I wanted to say is that I think that one of the roles of that foundation will be, and I'm surprised that none of the panelists have mentioned this, is a policy role with respect to philanthropy. Because I know in South Africa, for example, the tax regime is not particularly friendly to philanthropy, and I think without a lot of effort or cost to the government, it could be. And I would think that that would be a necessary function of philanthropic institutions, is to create a better environment for giving.
Thank you. Musim, in the back.
Thank you. I'm Semi Kanyara from the Global Fund. I wanted to hear from the researchers that you've been doing some more information regarding private foundations, because I think now we hear quite a lot of establishments of private foundations that are by Africans of means and very family, shall I say, like the northern foundations. We're having quite hearing for quite some times about those. And then the second one that, in one of your questions, Madam Moderator, you said, is it African philanthropy or philanthropy in Africa? And if you put it as philanthropy in Africa, I think the sector that I'm missing here, which I think has been very instrumental on our continent, is the religious groups, the private investors from either religious foundations or just religious groups that have invested in hospitals, in schools, etc., over time, and from Europe specifically. And I wanted to hear a little bit about that, because I would have expected them to have quite some big voice here. During the liberation of Africa, those were the most instrumental partners that we had on this continent to help us go through those years.
Over to the panel. Barbara, and then...
Let me respond on the infrastructure and enabling environment, and then a little bit on religion, and I'll try to do it very quickly. It seems to me that we have an incredible role to play on this policy front, and we're not doing it particularly well. Sometimes that needs to be organized at country level just because the legal context can be possibly very different. We're having discussions, however, in the Arab region about a pan-Arab template for foundation law that would be jointly discussed and then lobbied for in terms of the individual context. And we want to do that because in most of our countries, I'm not sure if this is true in yours, NGO law and foundation law are bundled together. Now, if NGOs are seen as the enemy by some governments, or at least as their oppositional groups, they're going to immediately have security concerns and throw up barriers. Whereas foundations can be and should be partners with government, should be their R&D arm. So we think if we can delink these two sets of laws, we could perhaps make real progress in the growth of the philanthropic field. The second thing is you never know when you're going to have opportunity. So the women's organizations and the gender groups in Egypt that have been doing fairly business as usual work suddenly had the ability to advocate for constitutional articles that are going to be a sea change for us in places like Tunisia and Egypt. That every local council will have a quota of women elected to boards, so that women will have that first foot in the door for their ladder to rise to political power and influence. The same with endowments or waqf. Because that's been associated with religion, and religion is contested right now, we were in danger of not being able to legalize waqf endowments in Egypt. But the lobbying of a lot of different organizations at just the right time, and in my center we dropped everything and sent 100 white papers that we'd written to 100 delegates to the Constitution, saved the day, and we now are reestablishing something that Nasser had banned in 1964, so that citizens can leave endowments in perpetuity for public good. The problem with religion, I think, is that we associate it with politics. And in fact, the vast majority of religious giving is not necessarily political at all, and we need to help make those messages in contested areas. The other thing is that it can be strategic, because there's an assumption that religious giving is only charitable, or it's only little things in little places. We have a food bank in Egypt stimulated by religious desire that there not be a child who ever goes to bed hungry, and they are using state-of-the-art distribution means. They have 54 collaborating NGOs, and they feed millions of kids every month. To me, that's strategic philanthropy. And the motivations are faith, but that's a good thing, and I think we have to be careful not to criminalize it because of a certain political moment.
Halima, then Becky.
Okay, so I'll start with the question on the enabling environment, which is an important one. And I think there are several things to say about an enabling environment. Traditionally, when we talk about philanthropy and enabling environment, everybody assumes we talk about tax. But if we think about an African context and these multiple narratives of how giving happens on an everyday level amongst poor communities, these are not part of a tax base, nor will probably ever be part of a tax base. So the the thing around enabling environment is we need to broaden the understanding of what we're talking about when we talk about an enabling environment. At the one level, there are institutions working on the tax environment. So in South Africa, in Kenya, and in Nigeria, and in Egypt, in all of the 4 core centers, there are institutions in some way or form trying to advocate for legislative changes and for incentives on the tax space. There is a caveat to be put there, though, is that there's a movement around creating an enabling environment for philanthropy on the one hand, and there's a movement around tax justice on the other hand. And these 2 movements are happening in parallel, but not talking to each other. The one's asking for more incentives, the other one's saying, let's take away the incentives, without thinking about where they interact and intersect. And that there needs to be a conversation around that. The tax question is an important one. There are those who are working on it, but we need to be thinking much more strategically and carefully around what are the incentives we are creating and providing, and that those don't become loopholes. When we think about a broader definition of enabling environment, no one's talking about that right now. It's heard about in different spaces, but we need to be thinking much more strategically and concretely around what are the spaces and policies and forums that we can support and create that provide a different kind of enabling environment. You asked about private foundations, and the research we've been involved in has just been on the infrastructure sector. And I say this specifically because we don't have a mapping on the African continent of who the different philanthropic players are. Even in South Africa, where a lot of the activity is visible, we don't have a list of who's a private foundation, who are public foundations, who are community foundations. Community foundations we know better than the rest because, because there's a sector around that. But so we can't talk about what are the motivations and why do private foundations behave in a specific kind of way. And that's really part of the knowledge building agenda that Becky was talking about. We have increased writing in this field, but we really need to create the space to ask questions around not just who does what where, but also how, why, and to what end. And then we're in a better space to be able to answer the kind of questions you're asking. And Barbara's touched on religious groups, and I think the religious group question is both about religious funding coming in from outside, but also our own religious giving on the continent. There's a significant amount of faith-based giving that happens in Africa. It's never been counted as philanthropy, and this is because the narrative has always been talking about high, institutionalized, top-down kind of giving. So it's never operated as part of the philanthropic space and has not been engaged with. And that's really a flaw. It's something that we as the sector need to be conscious about, reaching out to the religious sector and the kind of religious giving that goes on, and bring them together in the same spaces that we are here now.
Okay, just to respond to maybe 2 questions. I think what you're beginning to see is that there's extensive literature already that is in existence. It's not really adequate for us to respond to everything. But briefly on the question of the legal environment or the policy environment, I wanted to speak to it so that it also addresses your question around whether we have a sector or not. And I think that it's important to locate philanthropic institutions or African philanthropy within the broader framework of civil society organizations. That philanthropic institutions are just but a constitutive part of the broader civil society. If you look at it from that point of view, then it means that we actually have a sector within a sector. And the philanthropic sector is one that Halima described as, it has emerged, it's beginning to gain momentum, and therefore we are at a stage where we are maturing. So we do have a sector within the third sector framework. But the reason why I'm saying this is because when you then go to look at the policy environment, and earlier on I referred to the book that we did on the enabling environment for civil society, you find that generally, from a political, economic, and even legal point of view, the environment for civil society in general is very restrictive. It varies from one country to the other, but generally there's a trend where there's a clamp down on civil society. And that means also on philanthropic institutions. In some countries, if you're a philanthropic organization and you fund, let's say, issues around LGDPI, you will be criminalized. So it doesn't matter whether you are international, you are local, or what. The point is that if you are funding issues that are criminalized by the government, you are also then held liable for that, and so forth and so on. So when you look at it, really there's a restriction of the space by government, there's restriction of the space by the economic environment, in which case I've talked about economic diplomacy. There's restriction of the space by the private sector, and so forth and so on. So you can really kind of categorize the various restrictions that affect the policy, the legal environment for civil society, and by definition for philanthropy. I think Halima has kind of addressed the specific issue around the legal environment for philanthropic institutions. At some point, I was talking to the colleagues at the AU who are setting up the AU Foundation, because we've been part of that discussion. And one of the things that really became clear from the beginning was that there wasn't any specific legal environment for the registration of the AU Foundation. They had to register in Mauritius, simply because that's where there was at least an enabling environment for the registration of such an entity. And of course, the challenge that I then threw to the colleagues there was that this is an opportunity for the continent to come up with a legal environment for such entities as foundations. If you go from one country to the other, I'm not aware of any statute that allows for the registration of a foundation. Rather, you register either as a non-profit organization, a Section 21 company, as a trust, and so on. So we don't have a universal framework on how to deal with foundations. So that's an area of opportunity with the new developments in the continent. I think the question there, we don't have enough time, but around the issues of, so what I've done in my writings earlier, that I've distinguished 3 categories. There's philanthropy in Africa, which has really been perhaps what most people knew about, which is international foundations, religious institutions that are of an international nature, but they are operating in Africa, right? Then we have philanthropy with African features. This need not be philanthropy in Africa, it could be anywhere, but it shares in the values and aspirations of Africans. So it could be Chinese, and so forth and so on. Then finally, is African philanthropy. And the reason why I've focused on African philanthropy is because we wanted to really position it at the same wavelength as the other philanthropies in the world. So it wouldn't make so much sense to me to focus a lot on philanthropy in Africa, even though I know it. I've written about it, but the real point is to position African philanthropy in that space where it is recognized equally as the other philanthropies universally. So you could call it a self-fulfilling prophecy that we have to really position this and take it as a political agenda to assert that there is African philanthropy and write about it more eloquently.
So I think that is a very neat close to this particular panel, that we really need to define, understand, put forward, and congregate around this notion of Africa, of African philanthropy, and especially if we're going to be members of the African Philanthropy Forum. So I want to say thank you to the panel. I'm sorry that we didn't have time to do another round of questions, but obviously we can continue the conversation over the next 2 days. Thank you so much.